The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of Boeotia, spilling gold across a land that had seen too much blood. Mist clung to the grass like the ghosts of warriors long forgotten, and the smell of dust and bronze drifted in the cool air. Beneath that growing light, two armies prepared for a collision that would shake the foundations of Greek warfare itself. It was the summer of 371 BCE, and for the first time in more than 2 centuries, Sparta's aura of invincibility was about to be tested by something new. Not a stronger army, not a divine intervention, but an idea. For generations, the crimson-cloaked warriors of Sparta had ruled the battlefields of Greece. From the smoking plains of Thermopylae to the bitter fields of Mantinea, their phalanx had become legend, a wall of bronze and muscle that crushed all who dared stand before it. Every Spartan boy had been molded from birth into a weapon. Every man had been trained to fight without fear, to die without hesitation. They were the embodiment of discipline, the living proof that war could be perfected. Other city-states had philosophers, poets, and traders. Sparta had soldiers. But on that fateful morning near the small town of Leuctra, another kind of genius stood waiting. One not born from blood or iron, but from thought. His name was Epaminondas of Thebes, a man whose mind would change the art of war forever. He was no ordinary general. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, possibilities where others saw limits.
To forge a new
where
balance
most commanders
for all of
tried to
Greece.
imitate Sparta, Epaminondas dared to outthink it. He understood that the greatest weapon on any battlefield was not the sword nor the spear, but the human mind. The Theban army that gathered behind him was smaller, less experienced, and far less feared. They did not march with the same perfect rhythm as the Spartans, nor did they possess the same glittering armor.
The flank must hold
Yet
here,
within their
unwavering.
ranks lay something far more dangerous, a formation, a plan, and a spirit unlike anything Greece had ever witnessed. Epaminondas had spent months shaping this army into an instrument of calculated destruction, and at its heart stood his most elite warriors, the sacred band of Thebes, 300 lovers bound together by devotion stronger than death itself. Across the field, the Spartans formed their traditional line, shields locked, spears lowered, a living wall 8 men deep. Shining in the sun like a single sheet of bronze, their king, Cleombrotus, commanded from the right wing, the position of honor and danger. His veterans stood silent, their confidence unbroken. They had seen rebellion after rebellion crumble beneath their disciplined advance. To them, Thebes was just another upstart city-state that would soon learn humility at the point of a Spartan spear. But something about the enemy's formation unsettled them. The Theban line looked wrong,
Their uneven line is not
even
madness,
lopsided.
it is a weapon.
The left
will meet
wing
their
was
strength
thicker,
with all of ours.
impossibly deep, like a battering ram of men. The right wing was thin, almost fragile. To a Spartan officer trained in the geometry of phalanx warfare, it made no sense. Battle lines were supposed to be even. Equal strength across the front was the foundation of all Greek strategy. Anything else was madness. And yet, the man facing them was no madman.
Hold the line. Stand
Epaminondas
firm for Sparta.
had crafted what history would later call the Oblique Order, a revolutionary tactic that concentrated overwhelming force at a single point while holding back the rest of the line. Instead of matching the Spartans evenly, he would smash them asymmetrically, throwing all his weight against their strongest wing. It was a dangerous gamble, but he understood something the Spartans did not. That even the mightiest formation, if struck in just the right place, could collapse like a wall of sand.
Hold the line.
As the two armies advanced, the earth trembled beneath the tramp of thousands of feet. Bronze met sunlight, and a low murmur rippled through the ranks, that electric silence before catastrophe. Veterans on both sides sensed that this would not be an ordinary clash of spears and shields. This would be the end of an era, Epaminondas raised his arm, the signal flashing through the Theban ranks. Drums thundered. The left wing surged forward, 50 men deep, a human avalanche of bronze and determination. At its tip, the sacred band led the charge, their eyes fixed on the gleaming Spartan line. They did not shout. They did not taunt. They simply advanced, silent, steady, unstoppable. Behind them, ranks upon ranks of Theban citizens pressed close, each man pushing the one before him, the collective force building like a wave before it crashes.
Thebes is
The Spartans
victorious.
braced for impact.
Leuctra
They had never
belongs
failed to
us.
break an enemy phalanx before. To them, this was routine, another test of endurance they would inevitably win. But when the two walls collided, the sound was
desire
unlike
is
anything
simple,
heard before on a
that my
Greek
city be
battlefield,
free,
a thunderclap of
and that
bronze,
Greece learn
flesh,
wisdom from
and
our
stone.
victory.
The Theban wedge slammed into the Spartan right wing with the weight of a mountain. Spears snapped, shields splintered, men screamed. For the first time in living memory, Spartan soldiers felt themselves being pushed backward. The perfect rhythm of
Then,
their advance
I have
shattered
lived long
under the
enough.
sheer mass of Theban
It is
momentum.
well.
Cleombrotus shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the chaos.
More
He fought in the
conflict.
front line like any other Spartan king, his bronze armor
Greece
dented,
resists
his shield
true
slicked
unity.
with blood. Around him, his veterans began to falter. The enemy's formation was too deep, too dense, their blows relentless, their unity terrifying. The sacred band carved forward, each pair of lovers fighting side by side, each man shielding his beloved with his life. They fought not for glory or
Thebes will
plunder,
pay for this
but for each
insolence.
other, and that made them unstoppable.
A fragile peace.
Step by step,
If any
they
at
forced
all.
the Spartans back, turning what had always been a contest of endurance into a storm of annihilation. Epaminondas watched from behind, reading the flow of the battle like a musician reading notes. He saw the Spartan line buckle, then twist, then break.
Thebes is lost
The moment
without
had
him.
come. He signaled the rest of his army to hold, to resist
Our
the
glory
temptation to
fades
rush
with our
forward.
general.
This was not about reckless victory. It was about precision. His oblique order demanded timing, patience, and nerve. As the right wing of Sparta crumbled, the rest of their formation began to unravel. Dust rose like smoke. Blood darkened the earth. The invincible
Cleombrotus,
Spartan
fallen!
phalanx, the terror of Greece for over 200 years, was collapsing
Sparta
before his
bleeds.
eyes.
Thebes rises.
And so began the death of Spartan supremacy. The first clash had lasted only moments, but in those moments the entire mythology
live
of Sparta
Messene!
began to
Long
unravel.
live Thebes!
The Spartans had built their legend on control, control of fear, of formation, of destiny itself. Yet now, in the heart of that boiling chaos, control was slipping through their fingers like sand. The unyielding rhythm of their advance, drilled into them since childhood, faltered. Lines bent where they had always held firm. The proud bronze wall that had once seemed unbreakable now rippled and trembled beneath the sheer weight of Theban pressure. Cleombrotus could feel it before he saw it. That subtle change
Our
in the sound
strategy
of
here
battle,
will divide
that
their
rising
forces.
pitch of panic. He had led men in dozens of campaigns, but never had he heard the Spartans
general!
cry out in fear. Now, the noise surrounded him. The grunts of men pushed backward, the splintering of shields,
leave two
the
daughters,
desperate clash of
Leuctra
spear against spear.
Mantinea.
Theban warriors surged forward like an unrelenting tide, their deep formation grinding into the Spartan line, each man driving his shoulder into the back of the one before him. At the very point of contact, where the sacred band fought shoulder to shoulder, the struggle was beyond comprehension. Blood turned the dust to mud beneath their feet. Men slipped, fell, were trampled underfoot. Yet the Thebans pressed on, their rhythm now the heartbeat of the battle itself. Epaminondas had designed this formation to achieve one thing, a rupture so deep and sudden that even Sparta's legendary discipline could not contain it. The Spartans had never faced such concentrated force. Their 8 ranks, built for precision and stability, were simply too shallow. They had always relied on balance, on the idea that every part of their line was equally strong, equally unbreakable. But that very symmetry was now their undoing. Against a wedge 50 men deep, their uniform front offered no answer. The Theban mass crashed into them with such intensity that the very geometry of the phalanx broke down. Men could no longer move as a single body. The sacred rhythm of Sparta, that perfect harmony of shield and spear, was gone. As Cleombrotus tried to rally his right wing, a Theban spear found its mark. The bronze tip pierced his side, driving deep between his ribs. He staggered, clutching at his wound, but even as the blood poured down his armor, he refused to fall. "Stand your ground," he roared, voice raw with fury. For a moment, it seemed his command might restore order, but fate had already turned against him. Another blow struck, this time to his neck, and the Spartan king collapsed into the dirt, lifeless beneath the weight of his shattered shield. News of his fall spread like wildfire through the ranks. The men who had been taught since childhood that a Spartan king could never die in battle without divine cause now saw their leader lying broken on the ground. For the first time in 2 centuries, the Spartan army hesitated, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, the Thebans struck even harder. Epaminondas saw the moment. He gave the signal, a single raised hand, calm and deliberate amid the chaos. His reserve troops advanced, not recklessly, but with precision, pressing into the widening gap where the Spartan right wing had begun to collapse. Dust filled the air, turning the morning light to a smoky haze. The sound was deafening, the clash of metal, the roar of thousands, the scream of wounded horses. The Spartan center tried to shift, to pivot and fill the void, but the oblique formation made it impossible. The Theban left wing had been deliberately angled back, refusing full engagement, preventing the Spartans from bringing their superior numbers to bear. While the Spartan right was being crushed, their center and left found themselves locked in indecision, unable to advance, unable to retreat. It was tactical genius on a level they could not comprehend. Epaminondas had turned the entire battlefield into a trap of geometry and psychology. Every move had been calculated to exploit the Spartan mindset. Their discipline, once their greatest strength, now chained them to a failing system. They had been trained to fight as a perfect unit, not as individuals. And when that unit cracked, so too did the minds of the men within it. Theban spears thrust forward with deadly precision. Shields slammed, warriors fell. The once proud line of Sparta disintegrated into fragments of desperate resistance. For the first time, Spartan soldiers turned and ran. Not many at first, just a few, retreating instinctively under pressure. But soon others followed. The collapse spread like a contagion. Across the field, the Theban right wing, thinner and weaker, held its position, deliberately avoiding full combat. Their task was not to win glory, but to hold back long enough for the left to deliver the killing blow. And deliver it they did. The wedge of 50 ranks pushed through the Spartan right, breaking it completely. Once the anchor of the Spartan army was gone, the rest of the formation began to unravel. Men who had been raised to believe that Spartans never retreated now faced an impossible choice: stand and die, or run and live. Their centuries-old code demanded one answer, but instinct demanded another. Many chose survival. Theban warriors surged into the breach, their momentum unstoppable. The battle was no longer a contest. It was a rout. Those Spartans who stood their ground were cut down where they fought. Those who fled were hunted through the fields. The crimson cloaks that had once terrified Greece now marked them for death, bright targets amid the dust and chaos. By midday, the Spartan army was in ruins. Their dead covered the field of Leuctra, and among them lay their king, a symbol of everything they had once believed unshakable. The Thebans did not cheer. They simply stood exhausted, staring across the devastation they had wrought. They had achieved the unthinkable, the destruction of Sparta's invincibility. Epaminondas rode slowly across the field, his face unreadable. Around him, the survivors of the sacred band stood silent, their armor dented, their bodies smeared with blood and dust. They had fought as one, and in doing so, they had changed the fate of Greece. For centuries, men had believed that the Spartan phalanx was the pinnacle of military evolution, the final word in warfare. But now, under the Boeotian sun, that illusion lay shattered. The secret weapon that had destroyed Sparta was not a new kind of weapon at all. It was a new kind of thought, the courage to challenge tradition, to see beyond the limits of what had always been done. Epaminondas had proven that no formation, no system, no empire was truly invincible. Every strength carries within it the seed of its own destruction, waiting only for the mind bold enough to find it. As the sun dipped toward the western hills, the field of Leuctra fell silent again. The dust settled. The cries faded. And in that quiet aftermath, a new age of warfare was born. When the echoes of battle finally faded, what remained on the field of Leuctra was not simply the wreckage of two armies, but the broken spine of an empire. The ground was littered with bronze shields and shattered spears, their edges glinting faintly in the late afternoon light. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that follows when history changes course. For more than 2 centuries, Sparta had stood at the center of the Greek world like an unmovable mountain. Their warriors had crushed Persia's elite, humbled Athens, and imposed their rule from the Aegean to the Peloponnese. Every city-state in Greece had, at one point or another, feared the crimson cloak and the gleam of the Spartan spear. To defy them was to defy inevitability itself. But on this day, inevitability had been slain. Word of the defeat spread faster than any army could march. By the time the Theban survivors returned home, the news had already crossed mountains and seas. Messengers galloped from polis to polis, their voices breathless with disbelief. "The Spartans have been defeated," they shouted. "Their king is dead. Their army destroyed." To the Greek world, it was as if the laws of nature had been rewritten. In Sparta itself, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The city that had never known fear suddenly tasted it. Mothers who had sent sons to battle expecting glory received only silence. The great agoge, the Spartan system of lifelong military training, had produced perfect soldiers, but not immortals. The myth of Spartan invincibility, nurtured for generations, had died in a single morning. The ruling council met in stunned disbelief. How could this be? How could a small city like Thebes, with no great empire, no legendary navy, no ancient bloodline of kings, accomplish what Persia, Athens, and countless others had failed to do? There was no comfort in the answer, because the truth was unbearable. Sparta had been defeated not by superior numbers, but by superior thought. Epaminondas's victory at Leuctra was not just a triumph of arms. It was a revolution of the mind. He had proven that genius could undo centuries of tradition. He had shown that war was not about repeating the past, but about reinventing it. And that realization shook every power in Greece to its core. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for Sparta. Their military prestige evaporated overnight. City-states that had once bowed obediently to Spartan dominance now began to stir with rebellion. Allies defected. Enemies gathered courage. Messenia, enslaved for centuries, rose in revolt, reclaiming its independence under Theban protection. The Helots, the serfs who had sustained Sparta's economy through forced labor, seized their chance for freedom, further bleeding the once mighty state. In the months that followed, Thebes emerged as the new center of power. Epaminondas led his forces deep into the Peloponnese, marching into territories that had once trembled at the mention of Sparta's name. He did not seek vengeance. He sought transformation. In his vision, Greece was not to be ruled by fear, but by balance. A federation of equals rather than an empire of submission. Under his direction, new cities were founded. Megalopolis in Arcadia to unite the fragmented tribes of the central Peloponnese, and Messene, built on the very soil where Spartans had once enslaved its people. On the slopes of Mount Ithome, freed Messenians raised walls and temples, their cheers echoing across the valleys, the sound of a people reborn. For Sparta, this was humiliation beyond endurance. The city that had once dictated the fate of Greece now struggled to defend its own borders. The Spartan army, once the pride of the world, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The loss of so many elite warriors at Leuctra had crippled its strength permanently. The Agoge still trained boys into soldiers, but the fire that had driven them, the belief in their divine superiority, was gone. Epaminondas, meanwhile, became the most admired man in Greece. Yet fame sat uneasily upon him. He was no tyrant, no conqueror drunk on power. He refused the crowns offered to him, the statues, the endless praise. When asked what he desired most, he simply replied, "That my city be free, and that Greece learn wisdom from our victory." His contemporaries struggled to understand him. In an age of ambition and greed, he sought neither empire nor tribute. His goal was philosophical as much as military, to reshape the moral order of the Greek world. The victory at Leuctra was not an end, but a beginning, a demonstration that intellect could triumph over brutality, that structure could defeat strength, that evolution was the soul of survival. But revolutions, even those born of brilliance, carry their own fragility. Thebes, though powerful, lacked the resources to hold Greece together for long. Rival city-states soon turned suspicion toward their new liberator. Old rivalries resurfaced. And as always, the gods of Greece seemed to demand balance. No single power could dominate forever. Still, for a fleeting moment, the torch of destiny burned in Theban hands. For that brief period, the name of Epaminondas carried the same weight that Leonidas and Pericles once had. Philosophers in Athens debated his tactics. Generals in Macedon studied his formations. A young man named Philip of Macedon, then a hostage in Thebes, watched and learned. In the years to come, he would adopt the lessons of Leuctra, refining them into a new system that would conquer the known world under his son, Alexander. Thus, the ripples of that single battle spread far beyond the plains of Boeotia. Leuctra was not just a victory of one city over another. It was the birth of modern strategy. It introduced the principle of concentration of force, the art of striking at the decisive point with overwhelming power, an idea that would echo through the centuries in the minds of Hannibal, Napoleon, and every commander who sought to win not by numbers, but by intellect. The oblique order, once mocked as madness, became the foundation of tactical thought. It taught the world that rigidity was death, that flexibility and innovation were the true weapons of victory. Even the Romans, centuries later, would study the battle as an example of how discipline must be balanced by adaptability. As for Sparta, its decline was irreversible. Though it survived as a city, its influence faded into the mists of history. No longer did its warriors march across Greece as masters of men. No longer did kings command armies that feared no enemy. The iron discipline that had built its greatness became a cage from which it could never escape. On quiet evenings in Thebes, the aging Epaminondas would walk the city walls, gazing across the plains where he had changed history. He was not a man of pride, but of reflection. Those who met him described his calm, his humility, his almost philosophical detachment from glory. "What was the true victory?" he once asked a student. "Not that we defeated Sparta, but that we defeated the idea that any power is eternal." When he died years later on another battlefield, pierced by a spear at Mantinea, his final words were said to be simple. "I leave 2 daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea." He meant not children of blood, but of thought, 2 battles that had proven the strength of mind over tradition, of vision over habit. And so, the man who had unmade Sparta passed into legend. The weapon that had finally crushed Spartan supremacy was not forged of bronze or iron, but of imagination. It was the human capacity to question, to adapt, to evolve, the same force that would shape the destiny of civilizations for millennia to come. As the centuries turned, poets would sing of Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans who died there. But those who studied the art of war, the thinkers, the dreamers, the generals, they remembered Leuctra. They remembered the moment when one man looked at the unbreakable and saw how it could be broken. And in that realization lies the eternal lesson of history, that no power, however great, is beyond the reach of a greater idea. Long after the dust of Leuctra had settled, its echo still rolled across the valleys of Greece. The battlefield itself became a quiet plain of remembrance. Farmers plowed the same soil where kings had fallen, and shepherds led their flocks across the ground where empires had ended. Yet for generations afterward, men still spoke of that morning, the moment when thought defeated tradition, when the unthinkable became real. The world did not change overnight. History rarely does. But the balance of power within Greece had shifted forever. Thebes stood at its zenith, not merely as a city of soldiers, but as a beacon of intellect. For the first time, Greece had witnessed a victory born not of numbers, not of divine favor, but of reason itself. Epaminondas' name spread beyond the Greek mainland. In Athens, philosophers discussed him as a man who had united the virtues of mind and courage. In Macedon, young generals studied his formations, tracing the invisible lines of the oblique order upon the dirt with wooden sticks. Across the Aegean, observers from Asia Minor marveled that a single innovation could rewrite centuries of military tradition. To understand his impact, one must look not only at the soldiers he commanded, but at the ideas he unleashed. Before Epaminondas, war in Greece had been a ritual, a test of endurance, an exercise in predictable symmetry. 2 armies would meet, phalanx against phalanx, line against line. Victory belonged to those who stood firm the longest. But Leuctra shattered that pattern. It introduced something terrifying and liberating all at once: uncertainty. For the first time, generals realized that warfare was not bound by custom. It was an art, a science, an ever-shifting landscape of possibilities. The battlefield was not merely a place of courage, but a canvas for thought. From this revelation would emerge a new generation of thinkers, men who saw in war not only destruction, but creation. Among them was a prince who watched from afar, Philip of Macedon. During his youth, Philip had lived as a hostage in Thebes, where he studied the very tactics that had undone Sparta. He learned directly from the disciples of Epaminondas, observing how they drilled soldiers not for blind obedience, but for adaptable coordination. Years later, when Philip returned to Macedon, he forged a new military system from those lessons: deeper, longer spears, flexible formations, a synthesis of discipline and innovation. His phalanx was born in the shadow of Theban genius. His strategy was built upon the foundations laid at Leuctra. And through Philip, those ideas would pass to his son, Alexander the Great, whose campaigns would carry Greek arms across Asia and into legend. When Alexander encircled enemies with hammer and anvil tactics, when he exploited terrain and concentrated force at decisive points, he was, knowingly or not, echoing Epaminondas. The intellectual lineage was clear, from Leuctra to Issus, from Thebes to Gaugamela. Thus, the fall of Sparta gave birth to something larger, a new era of military thought. The rigid certainties of the old world yielded to the fluid logic of strategy. The phalanx was no longer a monument, it was a tool, adaptable, malleable, alive. Commanders began to think beyond the line, to imagine depth, angle, momentum, and deception. The art of war became a mirror of the human mind itself. But Epaminondas's influence reached far beyond the battlefield. His ideas seeped into philosophy, politics, and the very conception of power. He had proven that supremacy built on fear and repetition would always crumble before imagination. That lesson resonated not only with soldiers, but with statesmen and thinkers, who saw in his victory the blueprint of all human progress. In Athens, scholars drew parallels between Leuctra and the nature of democracy. If no army was invincible, then no tyranny was eternal. Power, like a phalanx, could be broken by insight. Philosophers like Plato and later Aristotle contemplated the balance between reason and might, seeing in Epaminondas a model of virtue, the warrior philosopher who fought not for conquest but for harmony. In the centuries that followed, even as Greece fell under Macedonian and then Roman rule, the memory of Thebes's triumph endured. Roman generals studied Leuctra at their academies, admiring how one man had reshaped an entire mode of warfare. The historian Polybius wrote that Epaminondas surpassed all men of his age in the union of intellect and courage. To the Romans, masters of order, his victory was both inspiring and unsettling. It was a reminder that discipline without imagination is merely endurance without purpose. As empires rose and fell, the pattern repeated. The lesson of Leuctra became universal. That innovation is the true weapon of power. Whenever a new civilization emerged, whether in the East with the strategies of Sun Tzu or in the West with the doctrines of Caesar, the same principle echoed beneath the surface: adapt or perish. Centuries later, military theorists from Machiavelli to Clausewitz would still cite the wisdom of that ancient battle. The principle of concentration at the decisive point became a cornerstone of modern strategy. Napoleon himself, master of maneuver and momentum, once remarked that the greatest battles were won by the mind long before the first cannon is fired. In his campaigns, one could hear the faint echo of Epaminondas's oblique order, the idea that a single thrust, perfectly placed, could collapse even the strongest formation. And yet, for all his influence, Epaminondas remained a paradox, a man revered for victory, yet untouched by its corruption. While other conquerors built empires from blood, he built legacies from thought. He never sought to enslave or humiliate his enemies. His triumph over Sparta was not vengeance, but liberation, liberation from the illusion that power must always belong to the strongest. When later historians wrote of him, they often struggled to capture his essence. Xenophon, who admired Sparta, could not bring himself to praise the man who had destroyed it. Others, more objective, described him as the soul of freedom, the one who reminded Greece that even gods of war could fall to the logic of human reason. The city of Thebes itself would not long survive as a great power. Within a generation, it too would fall, first to Macedon, then to Rome. But the idea that Epaminondas unleashed would live far longer than any wall or monument. His victory had revealed a truth about civilization itself, that every system, no matter how perfect, carries within it the flaw of complacency. The moment it stops evolving, it begins to die. In that sense, Leuctra was not merely the end of Spartan supremacy, it was the rebirth of progress. It showed that human potential lies not in repetition, but in reinvention. That every generation must challenge its own traditions, test its own limits, and dare to see differently. Standing today on the quiet field of Leuctra, one would find little to mark the place. No grand monument rises there, no marble statue of Epaminondas gazes across the plains. Only a few weathered stones remain, their inscriptions faded by time. But perhaps that is fitting. For his true monument lies not in stone, but in the enduring human habit of questioning, of refusing to accept that anything, even greatness, is permanent. The sun sets over Boeotia much as it did that fateful day. The hills glow red, the fields shimmer with evening light, and the wind whispers through the tall grass. Somewhere beneath that soil lie the remnants of bronze shields, fragments of armor, the bones of men who fought believing they could never be defeated. And somewhere, unseen but eternal, lingers the spirit of the man who proved them wrong. Epaminondas's victory was not simply a historical event. It was a declaration that the mind is the ultimate weapon, and that every empire, every army, every idea must bow before the power of thought. The weapon that crushed Spartan supremacy was never meant to destroy. It was meant to awaken. And in the centuries since, every act of innovation, every challenge to tyranny, every moment when courage and intellect joined hands, all of it carries in some small way the echo of Leuctra. Time is the great conqueror. It erases empires, silences kings, and buries even the loudest of victories beneath the quiet dust of centuries. Yet some moments defy that silence. Some names refuse to fade. Not because of armies or monuments, but because of what they taught the world about the human mind, its courage, its imagination, its endless ability to see beyond the impossible. Leuctra was one of those moments. Long after the cries of battle had vanished and the bronze weapons had turned to rust, the spirit of that field continued to breathe through the ages. It lived in the strategies of generals, in the reflections of philosophers, and in the hearts of those who believed that thought could triumph over might. Epaminondas himself would not live to see the full flowering of his revolution. 9 years after Leuctra, he once again led Theban troops into battle, this time at Mantinea, where Greece's fractious city-states, unable to accept peace, had once more descended into chaos. The battlefield was crowded with familiar banners: Spartans, Athenians, Arcadians, old rivals bound together by nothing but fear of Thebes. It was a strange irony that the man who had freed Greece from Spartan domination would now face an alliance of those he had liberated. As the armies clashed, Epaminondas fought as he always had, not from behind, but in the front, where the danger was greatest. Once again, his tactics carried the day. The Theban forces outmaneuvered their enemies and broke through their lines. But in the moment of triumph, fate struck its final blow. A Spartan spear pierced his chest, driving deep into his lung. His men rushed to carry him from the field, his lifeblood staining the earth red. When his soldiers told him that victory was assured, Epaminondas smiled faintly. "Then," he whispered, "I have lived long enough." He asked if his shield had been saved. When told it had, he nodded. "It is well." Moments later, he drew his last breath, the philosopher general dying not as a conqueror, but as a man content that his vision had endured. With his death, Thebes lost its light. No other leader possessed his balance of intellect and humility, his ability to wield power without becoming its prisoner. Within a generation, the city he had made great was conquered, its walls leveled by Alexander the Great, the ultimate heir to his tactical genius. Yet even as Alexander's armies marched east, carrying Greek banners to the ends of the earth, the essence of Epaminondas marched with them. Every maneuver, every adaptation, every victory born of insight rather than brute force, All bore his invisible signature. History often remembers those who build empires more than those who teach the world why they rise and fall. But the quiet truth of Leuctra outlived the noise of conquest. For though Sparta was gone, and Thebes was gone, and even mighty Macedon would one day crumble, the principle that had defeated them all endured, that no power is absolute, and no idea is untouchable. The legacy of Epaminondas became something larger than war. It became a philosophy of life itself. Generations of thinkers found in his story a mirror for their own struggles. The scientist challenging accepted truth, the artist defying convention, the reformer standing against the machinery of tradition. His victory became a symbol for every act of courage that begins not with the sword, but with a question. Centuries later, Roman historians would still speak his name with reverence. Cicero called him the first man of Greece. Plutarch described him as a man who spoke wisdom as he wielded his spear. To them, he was not merely a general, but a philosopher of power, one who had understood that the greatest victories are not those won over others, but those won over fear, inertia, and the limits of imagination. In the Middle Ages, when Europe once again drowned in wars of tradition and dogma, scholars rediscovered the writings of ancient historians who spoke of Thebes. To the humanists of the Renaissance, Epaminondas became an emblem of the rebirth of reason. His tactics were studied alongside the works of Plato and Aristotle. His life retold as an example of balance between wisdom and courage. Even Machiavelli, who prized cunning above morality, admired him as one of the few men who had mastered both the sword and the soul. And in every century since, whenever a new thinker or leader dared to defy the established order, whether on the battlefield, in politics, or in the realm of ideas, the spirit of Leuctra stirred again. It whispered that no structure, however mighty, is beyond transformation, that the secret weapon of humanity has never been strength, but curiosity. For what Epaminondas truly did at Leuctra was not to destroy Sparta, but to liberate history from repetition. Before him, war had been ritual. After him, it became innovation. Before him, armies fought by imitation. After him, they fought by imagination. His victory was not simply a tactical breakthrough. It was the dawn of intellectual warfare, the recognition that knowledge, creativity, and timing could overcome any tradition, no matter how sacred. Every time a strategist studied the angles of a map, every time a scientist challenged an old theory, every time an artist defied the conventions of his age, they walked in his shadow. His genius had transcended the battlefield to become a universal truth, that the mind, when guided by vision and courage, can reshape the world. And yet, as with all such truths, the lesson of Leuctra must be learned again and again. Power hardens. Tradition calcifies. Every age builds its own Sparta, systems so rigid they forget why they were built. And every age needs its Epaminondas, the thinker who dares to strike at the flaw in perfection, who reminds the world that no empire of thought or power is eternal. If you stand today on the plains of Boeotia, there is little to see. The land is quiet, the hills soft with green. A few broken stones mark the site of the old Theban memorial, a simple lion carved from limestone, weathered and silent. It watches over the graves of those who fell that day, its eyes fixed forever toward the horizon. The wind moves through the grass like a whisper of memory, carrying echoes of bronze and battle cries long turned to silence. But if you listen closely, if you let imagination replace the centuries, you can almost hear it again. The thunder of feet, the clash of shields, the roar of men who believed they could never fall. And then, in that stillness after the storm, you can feel the deeper silence that followed. The silence of realization. When the world understood that even legends can bleed. That is the true legacy of Epaminondas, Not the empire he built, for he built none. Not the monuments he raised, for he raised few. His legacy is the eternal rebellion of thought against habit, the belief that what has always been need not always be. Every generation returns to Leuctra in its own way. Scientists return to it when they overturn a law of nature. Artists return to it when they create beauty the world is not ready for. Visionaries return to it when they imagine societies unshackled by fear or tradition. For Leuctra is not a place. It is a moment, endlessly reborn in the human story. The Spartans believed they were immortal. Epaminondas proved that immortality belongs only to ideas. In the end, his life and his victory remind us of a simple truth, that the greatest revolutions are not born from violence, but from vision, that the most powerful weapons are not forged in fire, but in the quiet of the mind, and that no army, no empire, no institution can stand forever against the force of a new idea whose time has come. So when we speak of the weapon that finally crushed Spartan supremacy, we are not speaking of spears or soldiers or formations. We are speaking of something far more enduring, the human imagination, sharpened by courage and wielded with purpose. The bronze of Sparta has long since turned to dust. The stones of Thebes have crumbled. But the spark that Epaminondas lit, that bold defiance of the inevitable, still burns wherever minds refuse to kneel before tradition. And that is why, across the gulf of 24 centuries, his victory still matters. Because as long as there are those who question the unbreakable, who look at the walls of power and dare to see the cracks within, Leuctra will never truly end. The field is eternal. The battle is eternal. And so is the idea that won it.